The very next morning, the reality of my new position in the household was cemented. It was Sunday, a day that in Atlanta's elite circles meant morning church service, followed by an extravagant sprawling dinner. Juliette had invited a dozen of her closest friends from her exclusive high society congregation. These were women who wore wide-brimmed hats, tailored suits, and carried themselves with the manufactured grace of people desperately trying to prove their net worth. At 6 in the morning, Nia marched down the basement stairs and handed me a 3-page grocery list. She demanded a full Southern feast: fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, candied yams, slow-cooked collard greens, and from-scratch peach cobbler. "Aunt Julie's friends have very refined palates, Vivian," Nia instructed, tapping her manicured acrylic nails against the wooden railing. "Do not embarrass us with that bland working-class seasoning you usually use. And just to be clear, there will not be enough room at the formal dining table for you. You can eat whatever is left over down here in the basement once the guests are finished." I took the list without a single word of protest. I tied my apron, drove to the grocery store in my reliable 10-year-old sedan, and spent the next 6 hours meticulously preparing the feast. The grocery bill alone was nearly $300, which Nia had insisted I put on the supplemental credit card Derek had supposedly given me out of the goodness of his heart. The irony was entirely lost on Nia. She demanded authentic Southern cooking to impress her high society friends, yet she looked down on the very roots that created it. She wanted the flavor of our culture, without the struggle, the aesthetic of extreme wealth, without the actual bank account to back it up. By 3 in the afternoon, the mansion smelled divine. The doorbell chimed and a parade of silk pearls and heavy perfume flooded into my foyer. I stood silently near the kitchen door watching as Julie held court in the center of the living room. She kissed cheeks, accepted compliments on her counterfeit designer dress, and poured expensive champagne that I had paid for. Derek stood by the massive stone fireplace, adjusting his designer tie and projecting the image of a young self-made mogul. I brought out the food in heavy silver serving dishes, moving quietly around the massive mahogany dining table. The aroma of butter sage and roasted garlic filled the room, but none of the guests offered a single word of thanks to the woman who cooked it. As I set down a platter of golden fried chicken, the conversation naturally turned to the house itself. "This estate is simply breathtaking, Juliette," one of the guests, a woman dripping in gaudy diamonds, remarked. "The property values in Alpharetta have skyrocketed recently. You must be so incredibly proud of your nephew." Julie took a delicate sip of her champagne and sighed with mock humility. "Oh, we are incredibly proud of Derek. He is a vice president at his firm now, making massive waves in venture capital, but to be completely honest, he bought this mansion out of pure charity." I paused by the doorway, my grip tightening on the empty silver tray. Julie lowered her voice, feigning deep sympathy, as she pointed a manicured finger in my general direction. "When my poor brother passed away, he left Vivian absolutely destitute. She was drowning in medical debt and terrible mortgages. Derek could not bear to see his mother put out on the street. So he bought this multi-million-dollar home with his own money just to keep a roof over her head. Nia and Derek even let her stay in the basement so she does not feel entirely useless." Nia chimed in immediately, eager to play the role of the benevolent daughter-in-law. "It is a huge sacrifice, of course. We had to give up our privacy. But Derek makes a massive salary, and we believe in taking care of the less fortunate. Vivian means well, bless her heart. She just lacks the education to manage complicated finances." The guests murmured in collective pity, casting condescending glances my way. I kept my expression perfectly blank. I walked back into the kitchen, the sound of their laughter ringing in my ears. Derek had not bought this house. He did not even have the credit score to qualify for a luxury car loan without a co-signer. I owned this house outright. I had paid cash for it a decade ago. Derek was currently transferring $4,000 a month into a shell company account, firmly believing he was paying the mortgage to a strict corporate landlord. He was literally paying his own mother rent to live in the house he claimed he owned. The dinner progressed, and the sheer volume of their arrogance filled the dining room. Seated next to Derek was a man named Marcus Vance, though I will simply call him the banker. He was a senior executive at a prominent regional bank, the exact kind of man Derek desperately wanted to impress to secure a future partnership. "Derek, my boy," the banker boomed, slicing into his fried chicken. "The venture capital market is tightening. We are seeing a massive shift in mezzanine financing. The interest rate yields are simply too volatile right now for aggressive acquisitions. If your firm is not careful, you will end up holding the bag on overvalued tech startups." Derek nodded vigorously, trying to look insightful. "Absolutely. We are playing it very safe, just sticking to traditional equity." "Vivian," Julie snapped, snapping her fingers at me as if calling a disobedient dog. "Fetch another bottle of the Cabernet from the wine cellar, and hurry up." I nodded submissively. "Right away, Julie." I walked to the temperature-controlled cellar, retrieved the vintage wine, and returned to the dining room. I approached the table, uncorked the bottle, and began pouring the rich red liquid into the banker's crystal glass. The banker was still pontificating. "It is a total disaster waiting to happen. The secondary market lacks liquidity. Anyone leveraging current assets against future mezzanine yields is an absolute fool." I finished pouring his wine. I placed the heavy bottle on the table, and then I looked directly into the banker's eyes. "Actually," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated, "the secondary market liquidity is only an issue if you are operating under the outdated assumption that institutional buyers are holding assets for short-term gains. If a firm structures their mezzanine debt with equity warrants, the volatility of the interest rate yield is entirely offset by the equity upside upon a structured exit. The real fools are the ones sitting on cash while mid-market valuations drop." The entire dining room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the expensive Persian rug. The banker froze his wine glass halfway to his mouth. He stared at me, his eyes wide with genuine shock. He recognized instantly that I was not just repeating words. I had just dismantled his entire financial argument with the surgical precision of a seasoned Wall Street veteran. Derek's face turned the color of chalk. Nia's jaw dropped. Julie looked as if she had just been slapped across the face. "I beg your pardon?" the banker stammered, setting his glass down heavily. "Where on earth did you learn about equity warrants?" I offered him a polite, entirely vacuous smile. "Oh, my late husband used to leave the financial news on the television while I dusted the living room. You pick up a few things here and there. Enjoy your wine, sir." I bowed my head slightly, picked up my serving tray, and walked quietly back into the kitchen. Less than 30 seconds later, the kitchen door swung open violently. Derek marched in his face, twisted in absolute fury. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip tight enough to bruise, and yanked me out of sight of the swinging door. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Derek hissed, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "Are you out of your mind? That is a managing partner at one of the biggest banks in Georgia. You do not speak to him. You do not speak to anyone at that table. You are here to serve food and keep your mouth shut." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then back up to his panicked eyes. He was terrified. He was terrified that the banker would realize a Maid understood venture capital better than a so-called vice president. "I was just making conversation, Derek," I said softly, playing the role of the confused, well-meaning mother. "I did not mean to offend your friends." "You embarrassed me," Derek spat, releasing my arm as if I burned him. "You made me look like an idiot. Nia and Aunt Julie are out there trying to build connections for our family, and you are rambling about things you do not understand. You are a widow who cleans houses. Act like it. If you ever humiliate me in front of my peers again, I swear to God I will throw you out on the street. Do you understand me?" He glared at me, his chest heaving. The sheer disrespect, the absolute contempt in his voice would have crushed any normal mother. But it only fueled my fire. I looked at my son, noting the sweat forming on his brow, the desperate need for validation hiding behind his cruel words. He was weak. He was entirely dependent on a facade he could not afford to maintain. "I understand perfectly, Derek," I whispered, lowering my eyes submissively. "It will not happen again." "It better not," he sneered, turning on his heel and pushing his way back into the dining room to salvage his fake reputation. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses resuming next door. I rubbed my arm where he had grabbed me, feeling the faint throb of a forming bruise. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, calculating determination solidifying in my mind. Derek wanted to play the role of the ruthless corporate tycoon. He wanted to treat his mother like a disposable peasant while feeding off her secret labor. He wanted to rule a kingdom he did not build. I walked over to the kitchen sink and washed my hands. The lavender soap foamed over my skin as I planned my exact next move. Tomorrow was Monday. Derek would put on his expensive suit, drive to his venture capital firm, and pretend to be a master of the universe. And I would log into my secure portal, contact my chief executive officer, and begin the silent, systematic dismantling of his entire life. The Sunday dinner humiliation was merely the appetizer. The main course was coming, and they would all choke on it. The very next afternoon, the reality of my new existence was pushed to a breaking point. I had just returned from a mandatory grocery run, my sedan loaded down with expensive imported waters and organic kale that Naya had suddenly decided were absolute necessities for her influencer lifestyle. As I pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the estate, my eyes locked onto a massive rusted steel dumpster sitting squarely on the pristine cobblestone. I parked the car, my heart hammering a strange, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I walked slowly toward the towering metal bin. The Georgia heat was sweltering, pressing down on my shoulders as I peered over the chipped edge of the dumpster. What I saw inside made my breath catch sharply in my throat. Tossed carelessly among torn cardboard boxes and bubble wrap were dozens of familiar square sleeves. They were my late husband Marcus's vintage jazz records. These were not just any records. They were a carefully curated collection he had spent a lifetime building. Original pressings of John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk. Albums we had scoured dusty antique shops for during our early years of marriage, back when we had nothing but each other and a shared dream. I could see the corner of a rare Ella Fitzgerald album bent and smeared with discarded coffee grounds. A pristine vinyl disc had slipped from its sleeve and lay fractured in half against a discarded piece of drywall. The sheer disrespect of it felt like a physical blow to my chest. They had not just thrown away vinyl. They had thrown away Marcus. They had thrown away our history, our love, and the very foundation of the home they were currently occupying. I reached down, my hands trembling, and pulled a battered Duke Ellington sleeve from the wreckage. I brushed a layer of dirt from the cover, holding it against my chest. My vision blurred, but I forced the tears back down. Crying was a luxury I could not afford right now. Anger was a much more useful emotion. I turned on my heel and marched straight toward the heavy double doors of the mansion. The moment I stepped inside the foyer, the chaos of their so-called renovations assaulted my senses. The elegant, understated warmth of my home was being systematically eradicated. Nia and Juli were standing in the center of the formal living room, surrounded by a mountain of packaging materials. Gone were the beautiful hand-carved mahogany end tables Marcus and I had brought back from a trip to West Africa. Gone were the subtle classic oil paintings that had graced the walls for over a decade. In their place, Nia was enthusiastically unboxing what could only be described as a masterclass in cheap, gaudy aesthetics. She was pulling out massive, shiny gold-plated geometric statues that looked like they belonged in a discount hotel lobby. Juli was directing the placement of a faux marble coffee table with bright brass legs, her counterfeit designer bangles clinking noisily as she pointed. They were desperately trying to manufacture an Atlanta elite aesthetic, substituting genuine class for shiny mass-produced garbage they had likely ordered online in bulk. It was an offensive display of new money desperation, crafted by two women who had absolutely no money of their own. Nia held up a hideous, oversized mirrored clock and squealed, "Aunt Juli, this is going to look absolutely stunning in the background of my next brand partnership video." "It screams luxury." Juli nodded approvingly, adjusting the collar of her silk blouse. "Exactly, darling. We have to completely scrub the working-class stench from this property. I do not know how my brother lived with all that dusty, depressing junk for so long. Those old records smelled like a thrift store. We are bringing this estate into the modern era. I stepped fully into the living room, the damaged Duke Ellington record still clutched tightly in my hands. "What do you think you are doing?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and steady. Nia jumped slightly, turning to face me. She let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, Vivian, you are back." "Good. Did you get the sparkling water I specifically asked for? And we need you to break down all these boxes and take them out to the dumpster." I ignored her demands. I held up the record cover. "You threw away Marcus's jazz collection. Those records were priceless. They were the only things of his I had left down here. You had no right to touch them." Julie scoffed, stepping forward with a look of utter disdain. "Do not raise your voice in this house, Vivian. Those records were an eyesore. They did not match the new creative direction Nia is taking the living space. We cannot have important guests stepping into a museum of depressing relics. We are doing you a favor by decluttering. You should be thanking us." "They are not yours to declutter," I said, taking a step toward Julie. My heart was pounding, the urge to slap the arrogant smirk off her face almost overwhelming. "This is my house. You do not just throw away another person's belongings without asking." Before Julie could snap back, the heavy wooden doors of the study swung open. Derek strode into the room. He had been working from home today, dressed in an expensive button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to project the image of a busy executive. He took one look at the tension in the room and instantly scowled. "What is all this yelling?" Derek demanded, marching over to stand protectively beside his wife. "Mom, why are you screaming at Naya and Aunt Julie?" I turned to my son, holding out the ruined record. "Derek, they threw your father's entire jazz collection into the rented dumpster outside. They destroyed his records. You know how much he loved those. You know how much they meant to me." Derek barely glanced at the battered cardboard sleeve in my hands. He let out a long, heavy breath, rubbing his temples as if I were giving him a massive headache. "Mom, stop being so dramatic over some old, scratched-up vinyl. Nia told me she was clearing out the junk to make the house more presentable." I agreed with her. The living room needed an upgrade. It looked like an antique shop in here. I stared at him, absolutely, completely stunned by his callousness. "An upgrade," I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You call this cheap gold-plated garbage an upgrade over your own father's legacy?" Derek's face hardened. His eyes narrowed, and the last remaining trace of the little boy I had raised vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, arrogant stranger. He stepped directly into my personal space, towering over me to use his physical size as intimidation. "Listen to me very carefully, Mom," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You need to get one thing straight right now. You do not get to dictate what happens in this house anymore. I am the one bringing in the big paychecks. I am the one keeping this roof over your head. I pay the bills here, Mom. It is my house now. If Nia wants to throw out old junk to make the space look better, she is going to do it. You are living here under my charity, so you will keep your mouth shut, clean up these boxes, and learn your place." He stared me down, daring me to challenge him. Nia smirked triumphantly from behind his shoulder, linking her arm through his. Julie let out a soft, satisfied chuckle, picking up a gold-plated decorative bowl and admiring her reflection in it. They stood there, a united front of entitlement, waiting for the poor, destitute widow to break down, apologize, and scurry back to her basement. They wanted me to submit to the crushing blow of Derek's words. I looked at my son's angry, arrogant face. I looked at the hideous decor scattered across my beautiful hardwood floors. I tightened my grip on the jazz record. And then I simply nodded. "You are right, Derek," I said softly, stripping every ounce of emotion from my voice. "I understand. I will take care of the boxes." Derek snorted, turning his back on me. "See that you do, and make sure dinner is ready by 7. I turned around and walked back toward the kitchen, my face impassive. But beneath my calm exterior, a brilliant, terrifying fire was raging. Derek truly believed his own lies. He genuinely believed that the massive chunk of his salary he transferred every month was keeping this estate afloat. He thought he was the ultimate provider, the wealthy patriarch carrying the burden of his poor, uneducated mother. He had no idea about the secret reality of his situation. When Derek and Nia had begged to move in, claiming they wanted to save money while living in luxury, I knew exactly how entitled they could be. I wanted to teach my son financial responsibility. So, I set up a legal barrier. I told Derek that the house was tied up in a complicated corporate trust left behind by his father, and that if he wanted to live here and eventually inherit the property, he had to take over the monthly payments to the trust's holding company. Derek, eager to play the big shot, eagerly signed the paperwork without ever reading the fine print. Every single month, on the first of the month, his bank account automatically drafted $4,000 and deposited it directly into an LLC named Caldwell Holdings. He thought Caldwell Holdings was an intimidating corporate entity, managing my late husband's debts. He thought he was paying the mortgage. But Caldwell Holdings was a shell company, and I was the sole proprietor. I owned this house free and clear. There was no mortgage, there was no debt. Derek was not paying the bills. He was paying me rent. For 6 months, I had been taking my own son's rent money and quietly moving it into a high-yield investment account. He was essentially funding his own eventual eviction. He thought he was the master of the house, but he was nothing more than a glorified tenant with a terrible attitude and an ugly taste in decor. I walked into the kitchen and set the damaged record gently on the granite counter. I smoothed my hand over Duke Ellington's face, making a silent promise to Marcus. They had destroyed his music, but I was going to destroy their entire false reality. Derek wanted to claim that his vice president's salary gave him the right to treat me like a servant. He wanted to claim ownership of my domain. It was time to remind him who actually owned the firm that paid that salary. It was time to pull the strings I had been quietly holding in the dark. I pulled my phone from my apron pocket. I did not need to scream or cry. I just needed to make one phone call. I pulled up the encrypted contact for Richard Sterling, the CEO of the venture capital firm where Derek worked. My employee. I tapped the screen and held the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone. They wanted to erase my past. I was going to erase their future. I ended the call with Richard almost as soon as he answered. I told him to stand by. I needed more ammunition first. I needed to see exactly how far my son was willing to fall before I pulled the net closed. I had to know if Derek was just a boastful fool trying to impress a superficial wife, or if there was a darker, more dangerous rot festering beneath his tailored suits. The answer arrived a few days later, turning the driveway of my estate into a showroom of their absolute delusions. On a bright Thursday afternoon, a massive flatbed transport truck pulled up to the front wrought iron gates. I was on my hands and knees in the foyer polishing the baseboards because Julie had complained about a smudge when the front doors burst open. Nia sprinted outside, squealing at the top of her lungs, her phone already recording a video for her meager social media following. Juli trailed right behind her, sipping a mimosa from a crystal flute and adjusting her designer sunglasses. I wiped my hands on my coarse Maid apron and stepped onto the porch to see what the commotion was about. A brand new custom chalk gray Porsche Panamera was being lowered onto my pristine cobblestone driveway. It was a $150,000 piece of machinery gleaming aggressively in the Georgia sun. "It is perfect!" Nia screamed, jumping up and down in her red bottom heels. Derek actually did it. He said he was getting me a push present for my brand launch, but I did not think he would go all out like this. A push present for a brand launch. The sheer unadulterated absurdity of the concept made me sick to my stomach. She did not have a successful brand. She had a smartphone, an inflated ego, and a desperate need for strangers on the internet to validate her existence. But there it was, a massive 6-figure car sitting on my property, bought and paid for by a son who could not even afford his own mortgage. Juli stepped forward, patting Nia on the back with a condescending smile. "Well, darling, when you marry into the Caldwell bloodline, you deserve nothing but the absolute best. We do not do modest in this family." As Juli raised her hand to take a sip of her drink, the harsh sunlight caught a massive blinding flash of light around her neck. It was a diamond tennis necklace, thick, heavy, and completely authentic. I had spent years moving in high society circles before my husband passed, and I recognized the jeweler clasp instantly. It was easily a $30,000 piece of jewelry. Julie, that necklace is absolutely stunning. Nia gasped, momentarily distracted from her new sports car. Oh, this little thing! Julie laughed, touching the diamonds with feigned modesty. Just a little treat to myself for surviving my terrible divorce. A woman has to maintain her standards after all. We cannot let people think we are slipping. I stood silently in the shadows of the porch holding my cleaning rag. The math in my head was flashing like a bright red warning siren. Derek made a very handsome salary as a vice president. He brought home perhaps $250,000 a year after taxes and bonuses. It was a great living, but it was certainly not Porsche Panamera and $30,000 diamond necklace money. Not when he was also paying $4,000 a month in rent to my shell company, funding Nia's daily shopping sprees, and apparently bankrolling his aunt's luxury lifestyle. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The numbers simply did not add up. I went back inside and continued my chores, letting them gloat over their expensive toys in the driveway. I spent the next 2 days walking softly, keeping my head down and listening closely. When you wear a maid apron, people forget that you have ears. They look right through you. They treat you like the furniture, and the furniture hears absolutely everything. The shiny, expensive facade began to crack on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen slowly polishing the silverware by hand. The house was mostly quiet. Julie had gone upstairs to take a long bath, and Nia was supposedly filming makeup content in my former office. Derek had come home early, skipped dinner entirely, and locked himself in his study. I needed to put the polished silver away in the dining room credenza, which shared a thin wall with the study. As I quietly slid the heavy wooden drawers open, I heard Derek's voice bleeding through the wall. He was not using his booming, arrogant corporate voice. He was hissing. He sounded desperate, terrified, and completely cornered. "Nia, you have to stop spending," Derek was saying, his voice vibrating with panic. "I am looking at the American Express statement right now on my laptop. You maxed out the platinum card again. We literally just paid it down last week. How did you spend $40,000 in 6 days?" I paused, setting a heavy silver spoon down on a velvet cloth without making a single sound. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, holding my breath. Nia's voice filtered through the wood, high-pitched, whining, and highly defensive. "I had to buy the new Chanel bags for the unboxing video, Derek. You know my followers expect a certain standard of luxury. You are a vice president at a major firm. Why are you acting like we are broke? Just move some money from your savings and cover it." "There is no savings." Derek's voice cracked. "We drained the entire savings account to pay the deposit for your car. The Porsche payment alone is killing us, and Aunt Julie is bleeding me dry. What does Julie have to do with this?" Nia demanded. "She lied about her divorce settlement." Derek snapped, his breathing heavy. "She got absolutely nothing in the divorce. She came here because she is dodging a massive debt. A high-stakes gambling syndicate out of Miami is looking for her. She owes them nearly $80,000. She forced me to buy that diamond necklace to pawn it off on the black market just to keep them quiet for another month. If they find out she is living here, they will show up at our front door and break my legs." I closed my eyes, absorbing the absolute shock of the revelation. A gambling syndicate? My sophisticated elite sister-in-law, who turned up her nose at my cooking and demanded ironed linens, was a degenerate gambler hiding from violent loan sharks. And my son, my educated corporate son, was buying her jewelry to pawn on the black market to cover her tracks. The level of delusion and criminality was staggering. "Derek, you have to fix this right now," Nia whined, completely ignoring the physical danger Julie had brought to our doorstep. "I have a luxury brand trip to Miami next month. I need my credit cards cleared so I can shop. I cannot look like a peasant in front of the other influencers. You promised me this lifestyle when we got married. Fix it." There was a long, heavy silence through the wall. I could almost hear the gears turning in my son's head. the sheer desperation taking over his remaining common sense. He was a coward cornered by the demands of the two toxic women he was trying to impress. Okay. Derek finally exhaled, his voice dropping an octave. Okay, do not panic. I will fix it. How? Nia asked, her tone instantly shifting back to greedy entitlement. I will move some company funds, Derek said. The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. There is an acquisition account at the firm. Derek continued whispering so quietly I had to strain to hear him. We are holding millions in escrow for a tech buyout that does not close for another 6 months. The oversight on that specific account is notoriously lax. I can wire a few $100,000 out through a fake vendor invoice, cover your credit cards, pay off Julie's loan sharks, and then put the money back before the quarterly audit. Nobody will ever know. Are you sure? Nia asked. She did not sound horrified that her husband was committing a federal crime. She did not tell him to stop. She just sounded impatient for the cash. I am the vice president, Nia, Derek said, puffing up his chest even though he was alone in the room with her. I know exactly how the system works. I control the ledger. Just keep acting normal. I will make the transfer tomorrow morning from my office. I backed away from the wall, my breathing shallow and incredibly fast. My son was not just a snob. He was not just an arrogant, entitled brat who treated his widowed mother like dirt. He was a corporate thief. He was actively preparing to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the very venture capital firm that I secretly owned. He was going to steal my money to fund his wife's vanity and his aunt's illegal gambling addiction. The sorrow I felt for the boy I had raised vanished entirely in that moment. It was burned away by a cold, furious, and absolute sense of justice. He had crossed a line that could never ever be uncrossed. I left the dining room, walked silently through the kitchen, and headed straight down the stairs to the basement. The concrete floor felt freezing through my thin slippers, but I did not care. I pulled my encrypted laptop from beneath the pile of old blankets where I had hidden it. I opened the screen and let the biometric scanner read my face. The system unlocked immediately. I bypassed my standard portfolio views and went straight into the internal, highly restricted network of the venture capital firm. Because I was the primary silent limited partner, I had supreme administrative access to every single ledger, every escrow account, and every wire transfer log in the entire building. My access superseded Derek's. It superseded his manager's. It was the digital equivalent of holding the master key to the entire bank vault. I navigated through the complex financial menus to the exact tech buyout escrow account Derek had mentioned. I set up a silent tracking alert. The moment any funds were moved from that account to an unverified vendor, I would receive an instant, untraceable notification to my personal phone. But I did not stop there. I needed to know exactly how deep this rot went. If he was willing to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars tomorrow without batting an eye, there was a very high probability he had already stolen before. I pulled up the historical transfer logs for Derek's entire department. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the cold, damp basement meticulously matching his vendor payouts against authorized firm acquisitions. It did not take long to find the glaring discrepancies. Small amounts at first. $10,000 here for consulting fees to an LLC that did not exist. $20,000 there for market research to a shell company registered in Delaware. The stolen amounts grew larger and much more frequent as the dates got closer to his extravagant wedding to Nia. He had been bleeding the firm dry for over a year. My son was a hardened criminal. He was sitting upstairs in my beautiful house, eating the food I bought, forcing me to wash his clothes, all while systematically robbing my company blind to fund his fake lifestyle. Every fancy dinner, every designer suit, every vacation he had bragged about was paid for with stolen money. My money. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark and reflecting my stoic face. The absolute betrayal was staggering, but I refused to shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was nobody's victim. I was the architect of their impending doom. I picked up my phone again. I dialed Richard Sterling's private number. Vivian Richard answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and professional. "It is late. Is everything all right?" "Hello, Richard," I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as the concrete walls surrounding me. "Everything is perfectly fine. But we have a rat in the firm. And I am going to need you to help me set a very specific, inescapable trap." The weeks leading up to Christmas were a masterclass in manufactured holiday cheer. Nia hired a luxury decorating service to transform the mansion into a winter wonderland entirely on Derek's stolen dime. Massive frosted artificial trees dominated the living spaces draped in ridiculous oversized gold ribbons that matched the gaudy new furniture. Julie paraded around the house organizing caterers and holiday party guest lists, acting as the grand matriarch of a dynasty she had absolutely no part in building. And I played my part flawlessly. I scrubbed the floors until they shined. I polished the imported crystal glasses they drank from. I ironed Nia's ridiculous holiday outfits and ignored the constant biting insults Julie threw my way. I let them believe I was thoroughly broken, a submissive servant grateful for the scraps they threw down the basement stairs. Every time Derek barked an order at me, I simply nodded, knowing that a massive invisible guillotine was hanging squarely over his arrogant head. Christmas Eve finally arrived. The air in Alpharetta was crisp and cold, but inside the mansion the fireplaces roared and the smell of expensive pine candles filled the rooms. Derek, Nia, and Julie had spent the entire evening sipping imported eggnog and exchanging lavish presents in the formal living room. I stood quietly near the doorway of the kitchen, wiping my hands on my coarse apron, watching the sickening display of unearned wealth. Derek gifted Nia a diamond-encrusted watch that easily cost $50,000. Nia squealed with delight, snapping photos for her social media followers. Julie unboxed a vintage designer handbag, praising Derek for his exceptional taste and unmatched generosity. They clinked their crystal glasses, toasting to their success, completely ignoring the woman who had cooked their massive holiday feast and cleaned up their discarded wrapping paper. Then Derek set his glass down on the faux marble coffee table. He turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, lacking any trace of holiday warmth. "Mom, come here," Derek commanded, waving his hand toward me. I walked slowly into the living room, keeping my head slightly bowed, playing the role of the obedient dependent. Nia and Julie exchanged a knowing, conspiratorial glance their smug smiles barely contained. Derek reached behind the heavily decorated Christmas tree and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He did not hand it to me with a smile. He shoved it roughly against my chest, forcing me to take it with both hands. "Merry Christmas." Vivian Julie sneered from the sofa, swirling the eggnog in her glass. "Do try to show some gratitude. Derek went through a lot of trouble to set this up for you." I looked down at the heavy envelope, feigning confusion. "What is this, Derek?" Derek straightened his posture, slipping easily into his arrogant corporate persona. "It is a tax protection transfer, Mom. I had my lawyers drafted up last week. Since you are not working, and you have zero income, holding the deed to this estate in your name is a massive liability. If you ever get sued, or if you fall ill and incur heavy medical debt, the state could seize the property." He pointed a firm finger at the envelope in my hands. "I am protecting you. All you have to do is sign those documents. It transfers the legal ownership of the house into an LLC that I manage. It keeps the asset secure under my corporate umbrella. I have already filled out the majority of the paperwork. I just need your signature on the last 3 pages, and I will have my notary finalize it on Monday morning." I stared at him, my heart turning to absolute ice. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his plan was almost impressive. He was not just stealing from my company. He was actively trying to steal my home. He wanted to strip away the very last asset he believed I possessed, leaving me completely at his mercy. He wanted to legally own the roof over my head so he could throw me out whenever he pleased. I opened the envelope and slid the heavy stack of legal documents out. I looked at the complicated legal jargon, the dense paragraphs designed to confuse and intimidate. I knew exactly what a property transfer looked like. I had executed dozens of them in my career. This was an ironclad, aggressive quitclaim deed. If I signed it, I would be legally signing away a multi-million-dollar property for absolutely nothing in return. Derek, I said softly, letting my voice tremble just a fraction. This is a lot of legal paperwork. I do not really understand what all these clauses mean. You do not need to understand it, Mom. Derek snapped, his patience evaporating instantly. I just explained it to you. It is for your own protection. Just sign the bottom line. I clutched the papers tightly to my chest, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. I appreciate you looking out for me, honey. But your father always told me never to sign any legal documents without letting a lawyer review them first. I just want to have someone look at it. I can bring it to a legal aid office next week just to be safe. The temperature in the room plummeted. Derek's face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, towering over me, just as he had done in the study days before. Are you seriously questioning me right now? Derek hissed, his voice echoing in the large room. I am a vice president of a venture capital firm. I handle multi-million-dollar acquisitions every single day. Do you think some strip mall legal aid lawyer knows more about asset protection than I do? Nia scoffed loudly from the couch. Honestly, Vivian, you are being incredibly ungrateful. Derek is trying to save you from your own financial ignorance, and you are treating him like a criminal. This is exactly why we cannot let you manage anything. You are paranoid and uneducated. I kept my eyes locked on Derek, maintaining my facade of fearful hesitation. Please, Derek. It is just a house. It is the only thing I have left of your father. I just need a few days to read it over. Derek's jaw clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might shatter. The veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. He realized that his smooth corporate gaslighting was not going to work. I was not going to blindly sign away my estate on Christmas Eve. He had to pivot. He had to use force. Fine, Derek growled, his eyes burning with malice. You want to play games, Mom? We will play games. Before I could react, Derek lunged forward. His hand darted toward the deep pocket of my Maid apron. He shoved his fingers inside and violently yanked out the silver supplemental credit card he had given me months ago. The plastic card snapped against the fabric as he ripped it away. I gasped, stepping back, clutching the unsigned deed. Derek, what are you doing? I am cutting you off, he yelled, waving the credit card in my face. You want to act like you are independent. You want to question my authority. Then you can pay for your own life. This card is deactivated as of right now. I am not paying for your gas. I am not paying for your groceries. I am not giving you a single dime of my hard-earned money until you sign this house over to my LLC. He shoved the credit card into his own pocket and glared down at me. You have absolutely nothing, Mom. You are living in a basement, eating the food I buy, and wearing the clothes I allow you to wear. If you do not sign those papers by Monday morning, I will pack up your miserable life and throw you out onto the street. We will see how long you last out there with zero income. I stood perfectly still, looking at the son who was threatening to starve his own mother into submission. He truly believed he had just stripped me of my only lifeline. He thought he had severed my access to the world, rendering me completely helpless. He had no idea the card he just confiscated had a credit limit of a measly $5,000, while the encrypted banking app on my phone held millions. Juli stood up from the sofa, smoothing her expensive skirt. She walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with Derek, looking at me with a terrifyingly cold, calculating smile. You really should listen to your son. Vivian, Juli said, her voice smooth and dangerous. He is offering you a very generous deal, because if you refuse, throwing you on the street is the least of your worries. She stepped closer, invading my space, her heavy perfume suffocating me. I know a few people on the state medical board, she whispered, her eyes locked onto mine. If you become difficult, if you start acting erratic and paranoid about your son trying to steal from you, it would be very easy for us to have you declared mentally unfit. We could have you committed. We will pack you away in a state-run nursing home, the kind where they medicate you until you forget your own name. Sign the deed, Vivian, or we will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life staring at a padded wall." The sheer evil of her threat hung heavily in the room. They were willing to institutionalize me. They were willing to drug me and lock me away just to secure the deed to a house they could not afford. They had completely abandoned any shred of human decency. I looked at Derek. He did not flinch. He did not defend me. He stood beside his aunt, arms crossed, fully supporting the threat. I looked down at the thick stack of papers in my hands. I held them tightly, letting the sharp edges press into my palms. I did not cry. I did not beg for mercy. I just offered them a slow, defeated nod. "I will read them over," I whispered, my voice sounding completely broken. Derek smirked, satisfied that his brutal tactics had worked. "You do that, and have them signed by Monday. Now get out of here and go back down to the basement. We are done looking at you for the night." I turned around and walked out of the formal living room. I crossed the grand foyer and opened the heavy wooden door leading down to my concrete prison. As I descended the stairs into the cold darkness, the sounds of their celebratory laughter echoed above me. They were celebrating their victory. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. I reached the bottom of the stairs and set the legal documents on the old wooden desk next to my hidden laptop. I reached out and turned on the single harsh bulb hanging from the ceiling. I stood in the harsh light and took a deep, steadying breath. They wanted to play hardball. They wanted to threaten me with starvation and state-run nursing homes. They had just given me the absolute moral clearance to ruin them without a single ounce of guilt. The holidays were over. The season of giving was finished. It was time to start taking everything away. The day after Christmas dawned bleak and gray, matching the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the mansion. I had not slept a single wink. I spent the entire night sitting at my small wooden desk in the basement, staring at the quitclaim deed Derek had shoved into my hands. My mind raced, calculating every angle, every legal loophole, and every financial snare I was about to lay for my son and his parasites. But I knew I had to maintain the facade just a little longer. I had to go upstairs and play the terrified, obedient maid for one more day to lull them into a false sense of absolute security. At 6 in the morning, I tied my coarse apron around my waist and climbed the wooden stairs to the main floor. The house was a disaster zone of discarded wrapping paper, half-empty champagne flutes, and leftover catered food. I spent hours cleaning the mess, moving silently like a ghost through my own home. By noon, the residents of the house began to stir. Nia and Juli emerged from their bedrooms, complaining about headaches and demanding fresh coffee and organic pastries. Derek marched into the kitchen shortly after, dressed in casual designer loungewear, ignoring me completely as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The deadline for signing the deed hung heavily in the air, an unspoken threat that dictated every interaction. After serving their breakfast, I retreated to the laundry room, which was situated in a small alcove right at the landing of the basement stairs. Juli had explicitly ordered me to hand wash and steam press her delicate silk blouses. She claimed the local dry cleaners were incompetent and that I was the only one who could be held accountable if her expensive wardrobe was ruined. I set up the heavy ironing board near the top of the stairwell, the mechanical hiss of the steam iron the only sound in the quiet alcove. I was exhausted. The physical toll of scrubbing the massive estate combined with the emotional strain of Derek's betrayal was pulling at my focus. I picked up a vibrant emerald green silk blouse, one of Juli's favorite pieces, and draped it carefully over the ironing board. I pressed the hot iron against the fabric, intending to smooth out a stubborn wrinkle near the collar. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. It was a secure alert from Caldwell Holdings. My eyes darted to the screen, distracted for just a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was all it took. A sharp, acrid smell filled the small laundry alcove. I gasped, yanking the heavy iron away from the fabric. But the damage was already done. A dark, jagged scorch mark the shape of the iron's tip was burned permanently into the delicate emerald silk of the collar. The fabric had melted, turning stiff and black. I stood frozen, staring at the ruined garment. Before I could even attempt to hide the mistake, the heavy footsteps of Juli echoed down the hallway. She marched into the alcove, a scowl already firmly planted on her face, likely coming to demand her clothes. Her eyes instantly locked onto the smoking green silk. The silence that followed was thick and incredibly dangerous. Julie's face contorted, her manicured hands balling into tight fists at her sides. She stared at the burned collar, and then her eyes snapped up to meet mine. The sheer hatred radiating from her gaze was palpable. "What have you done?" Julie hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. I took a step back, my shoulders hitting the wall near the basement door. "I am so sorry, Julie. I was distracted for just a second. The iron was too hot. I will pay to replace it, I swear." "Replace it!" she shrieked, the volume of her voice echoing through the entire house. "You stupid, incompetent old woman. That is a vintage piece. It cost over $2,000. You do not even have $2 to your name. You did this on purpose. You are jealous. You are a bitter, jealous peasant trying to ruin my things because you have nothing of your own." Her screaming drew an audience immediately. Derek and Nia hurried down the hallway, stopping just behind Julie in the narrow alcove. "What is going on?" Derek demanded, looking from Julie's furious face to the smoking blouse on the ironing board. "Your mother just destroyed my vintage silk blouse," Julie screamed, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "She burned it on purpose. She is acting out because you put her in her place last night. She is a vindictive, spiteful servant." Derek glared at me, his eyes devoid of any familial warmth. "Are you kidding me, Mom? You cannot even do basic laundry correctly. You are completely useless." I shook my head, keeping my hands raised in a placating gesture. "It was an accident, Derek. I swear it was an accident." I just looked away for 1 second. Julie let out a harsh, guttural sound of pure disgust. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a single aggressive stride. I was standing near the top of the basement stairs, my back almost against the open doorway leading down to the concrete steps. "I am sick of looking at your pathetic, lying face." Julie spat, her eyes wild with rage. Before I could brace myself, Julie raised both of her hands and shoved me hard in the center of my chest. The physical force of the blow caught me completely off guard. My feet scrambled for purchase on the smooth hardwood floor, but there was nothing to grip. My heel caught the edge of the top step. I lost my balance entirely, tipping backward into the dark stairwell. I tumbled down the wooden stairs, my shoulder slamming painfully against the wooden banister. I tried to catch myself, twisting my body to avoid hitting my head, but gravity pulled me down. I cascaded down the final few steps, crashing hard onto the concrete floor at the bottom of the landing. Pain radiated through my right shoulder and down my spine. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, leaving me gasping for air in the dim light of the basement. I lay there on the cold concrete, my apron tangled around my legs, my body aching from the sudden violent fall. I looked up the stairwell. At the top, silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway, stood Julie, Derek, and Nia. They were all looking down at me. Juli was breathing heavily, smoothing her hair back into place, looking entirely unapologetic. Nia had her hand over her mouth, but her eyes betrayed no sympathy, only morbid amusement. I waited for my son to act. I waited for the boy I had carried, the boy I had raised, to rush down the stairs to ask if I was hurt, to scold his aunt for putting her hands on his mother. I waited for a single shred of humanity to pierce through his corporate greed. Derek stared down at me, his expression flat and unyielding. He leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "Aunt Julie did not push you, Mom," Derek said, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. "You are just getting clumsy in your old age. You lost your balance because you were being careless. Stop being dramatic and get up. You are fine." I lay on the concrete floor, staring up at the son who was actively rewriting reality to protect his abusive aunt. He was looking right at me, watching me nurse a bruised shoulder, and he was gaslighting me with the ease of a seasoned sociopath. Nia chimed in, leaning against Derek's shoulder. "Seriously, Vivian, stop throwing a pity party on the floor. You ruined Aunt Julie's shirt, and now you are trying to make us feel bad for you. It is manipulative. Just stay down there until you are ready to sign the deed and apologize." Derek reached out and grabbed the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. "Think about your options, Mom," he warned coldly. Sign the papers or you will not even have that basement floor to sleep on. With a loud, decisive slam, Derek pulled the door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. The lock engaged. I was plunged into total darkness. I lay on the cold, hard concrete for a long time. The sharp, throbbing pain in my shoulder was a steady, rhythmic reminder of the physical assault I had just endured. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, chilling realization that had just solidified in my mind. My son was gone. The boy I loved had been consumed by a monster of greed, entitlement, and cruelty. He was willing to watch me be physically attacked. He was willing to lock me in a dark basement. He was willing to destroy my mind and steal my home, all to maintain a pathetic illusion of wealth. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed myself up off the floor. I ignored the stinging pain in my arm. I stood up in the pitch-black basement, letting my eyes adjust to the slivers of light creeping under the doorframes. I reached out and pulled the string of the single overhead bulb, flooding my small concrete prison with harsh, unforgiving light. I walked over to the small desk in the corner. I picked up the thick stack of legal documents, the quitclaim deed Derek wanted me to sign. I tore the papers precisely in half, then in half again, letting the shredded pieces fall like snow into the trash can beside the desk. I sat down in the wooden chair. I reached beneath the pile of old blankets and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I flipped it open, the glow of the screen illuminating my bruised, stoic face. The disguise was over. The submissive, helpless, uneducated widow was dead. She had died the moment Julie shoved her down those stairs, and Derek had shut the door. I flexed my fingers, typing my complex administrative passwords into the secure portal. The system verified my identity and granted me full, unrestricted access to the Caldwell Holdings master server. I navigated to the secure communications dashboard. I did not need to make a standard phone call this time. I needed a face-to-face encrypted connection. I initiated a direct video link to Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of the venture capital firm, the man who sat in the corner office, the man who paid Derek's salary, the man who reported directly to me. The screen loaded for a few seconds before Richard's face appeared. He was sitting in his expansive glass-walled office, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. His expression was serious and attentive. He knew that when I used the encrypted video portal, it was never for idle chat. "Good morning, Vivian," Richard said, his tone highly respectful. "I received your secure alert yesterday regarding the escrow accounts. I have the entire internal audit team on standby just as you requested. What are your orders?" I looked into the camera, my posture perfectly straight, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Richard," I said, staring directly into the lens, "it is time. I need you to initiate a full forensic lockdown on Derek's corporate accounts. Freeze his assets, revoke his building access, and prepare the embezzlement dossier for the federal authorities. He is planning to wire funds from the buyout escrow tomorrow morning. We are going to catch him in the act, and we are going to sever his head from the corporate body." Richard nodded slowly, taking notes on a secure pad. "Understood, Vivian, and the property deed." I touched my bruised shoulder, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. "Let the property management division know that Caldwell Holdings will be executing an immediate zero-notice eviction protocol for the Alpharetta estate. Prepare the foreclosure notices for his personal vehicles. I want his credit lines obliterated by dawn. When my son wakes up tomorrow, I want him to realize he does not own the kingdom. I want him to realize he is standing in the ashes of his own greed. Execute the protocol, Richard. Burn it all down." I paused, the cold air of the basement settling over my skin. A sharp, dark thought pierced through the initial wave of righteous anger. Firing Derek, freezing his accounts, and kicking him out onto the street was efficient. It was clean. But it was entirely too fast. It lacked the theatrical devastation required to truly dismantle a narcissist. Derek needed to feel the absolute height of untouchable power before the ground disappeared beneath his feet. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and calculated, "hold the termination sequence. Do not freeze the accounts just yet." Richard frowned, his professional demeanor wavering slightly on the video screen. "Vivian, if we do not freeze his access immediately, he will initiate the wire transfer from the escrow account tomorrow morning. He is going to steal more capital." "Let him," I replied, leaning closer to the glowing screen of my laptop. Let him make the transfer. Monitor every single digital footprint he leaves. Track the routing numbers, flag the destination accounts, and build an airtight federal case. But do not alert him. I want to know exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes before we bury him in it. Understood, Richard said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. I will initiate a silent, comprehensive audit across his entire department. We will have a complete financial autopsy by tomorrow afternoon. Perfect, I said. When the audit is complete, call me. The sun rose over the Alpharetta estate the next morning, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns. I was already on my hands and knees in the grand foyer, scrubbing the marble tiles with a harsh chemical cleaner. The physical labor was grueling, especially with the deep, throbbing ache radiating from my bruised shoulder. But the pain served as a potent, constant reminder of the mission. Every swipe of the sponge, every agonizing stretch of my arm fueled the fire burning behind my ribcage. Upstairs, the parasites were waking up. I could hear the muffled sounds of Nia's high heels clicking across the hardwood floors and Julie's demanding voice barking orders at Derek. They were preparing for another day of unearned luxury, blissfully unaware that the foundation of their entire existence was currently being dismantled by the woman scrubbing their floors. Derek marched down the grand staircase, stepping expertly around me as if I were nothing more than a misplaced piece of luggage. He wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, exuding the manufactured aura of a Wall Street titan. He did not look down. He did not ask about my fall. He simply adjusted his expensive silk tie and headed for the kitchen. "Make sure my espresso is ready," Derek demanded over his shoulder. "I have a massive day at the firm, big acquisitions. I do not have time to wait on your slow, clumsy hands." "Right away, Derek," I said softly, keeping my head bowed. I brought him his espresso in a pristine porcelain cup. He snatched it from the saucer, took a quick sip, and marched out the front door, slipping into the driver's seat of Nia's brand-new Porsche. The engine roared to life, a loud, obnoxious sound that echoed across the quiet neighborhood as he sped down the driveway. I watched him go, a small, genuine smile playing on my lips. He was driving straight into a digital ambush. Throughout the morning, I maintained my flawless facade. I dusted the gold-plated monstrosities Nia had cluttered the living room with. I vacuumed the thick Persian rugs. I steamed Julie's remaining silk blouses, taking exceptional care not to burn another collar. But beneath the submissive exterior, I was orchestrating a massive corporate war. Hidden beneath my thick apron was a small encrypted mobile device linked directly to the Caldwell Holdings master server. Every time I stepped into the pantry or the laundry alcove, I checked the incoming data streams. Richard's audit team was working with surgical precision. They were quietly pulling apart Derek's financial history, tracing years of fabricated vendor invoices, phantom consulting fees, and unauthorized account drains. At 2 in the afternoon, while I was polishing the massive mahogany dining table, the encrypted phone vibrated against my hip. I glanced around the empty room, ensuring Nia and Julie were occupied upstairs, before slipping into the temperature-controlled wine cellar. I closed the heavy glass door, shutting out the noise of the house, and accepted the secure video call. Richard appeared on the screen looking visibly shaken. He was a veteran of the financial industry, a man who had seen his fair share of corporate malfeasance, but the data he had just uncovered had clearly unnerved him. Vivian, Richard began, his voice tight. "The silent audit is complete. The results are substantially worse than we anticipated. Give me the exact number, Richard," I said, leaning against a rack of vintage Cabernet. $3.2 million, Richard stated, shaking his head in disbelief. Over the past 4 years, Derek has systematically embezzled $3.2 million from the firm's mezzanine financing reserves and escrow holding accounts. I let out a slow, measured breath. 3.2 million. The sheer magnitude of his theft was staggering. He had not just skimmed a little off the top to cover a bad month. He had built an entire alternative reality funded by massive coordinated corporate theft. Richard pulled up a detailed digital ledger, sharing his screen. He has been funneling the capital through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. We tracked the outflows. The funds were used to purchase high-end luxury vehicles, cover exorbitant credit card statements, and pay off a series of highly questionable private loans. The loan sharks, I murmured, recalling the panicked conversation I had overheard through the dining room wall. He used my company's money to pay off Julie's gambling syndicate. Exactly, Richard confirmed. And he just executed the wire transfer you predicted last night. $300,000 moved from the tech buyout escrow account directly into a dummy vendor profile at 9 o'clock this morning. We intercepted the routing sequence, flagged the transaction for federal review, and silently reversed the funds back into our holding account. He thinks the money cleared, but his shell account is entirely empty. I smiled. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. Derek was currently walking around the firm believing he had just successfully pulled off a massive heist, completely unaware that his stolen funds had already evaporated into thin air. "We have everything we need, Vivian," Richard said, his tone shifting back to strict professionalism. "The evidence is airtight. I have corporate security standing by in the lobby, and our legal team is prepared to contact the FBI. Give me the word, and I will have him escorted out of the building in handcuffs right now." I looked at the digital ledger on the screen, watching the red numbers detailing my son's ultimate betrayal. Arresting him today would be a swift, brutal end, but it would also give him the opportunity to play the victim. He would spin a narrative of corporate misunderstanding, claiming he was set up or overworked. He would look to Nia and Juli for sympathy, painting himself as a martyr crushed by a ruthless system. I could not allow that. I needed to isolate him entirely. I needed to inflate his ego to such catastrophic proportions that his inevitable crash would shatter his false reality beyond any hope of repair. "No," I said, my voice sharp and clear in the quiet wine cellar. "Do not arrest him. Do not call security. I want you to give him a promotion." Richard blinked, leaning closer to his camera, as if he had misheard me. "A promotion? Vivian, the man just stole $3 million. He is a walking federal indictment." "I am fully aware of his criminal status," Richard replied smoothly. "But Derek's greatest weakness is his absolute arrogance. He genuinely believes he is smarter than everyone else in the room. He thinks he is a financial genius who just outmaneuvered the entire firm. If we fire him now, he will panic and scramble. If we promote him, he will become careless. He will celebrate. He will double down on his toxic behavior at home, alienating everyone around him. I want him to stand on top of the mountain before I push him off." Richard's expression slowly transformed from confusion to grim understanding. He recognized the ruthless strategy taking shape. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Call him into your office," I instructed, pacing the length of the cellar. "Tell him you have been closely monitoring his recent acquisitions and his aggressive management style. Tell him the board is incredibly impressed with his initiative. Then offer him the position of senior partner." "Senior partner." Richard repeated, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "That comes with a corner office, a massive base salary increase, and full profit sharing." "Promise him the world," I said. "Tell him the paperwork will be finalized by the end of the week. Give him the keys to the executive washroom. Make him feel like an untouchable god. Because when he comes home tonight, he is going to believe he has secured his future forever. He is going to demand absolute submission from me. And he is going to promise Nia and Juli a lifestyle that will require them to spend money they no longer have." "It is a brilliant trap," Richard admitted, admiration creeping into his voice. "He will max out whatever credit lines he has left, celebrating a promotion that does not actually exist." "Exactly," I said, opening the heavy glass door of the cellar. "Execute the promotion, Richard. Make him feel invincible. I will handle the demolition on this end." I ended the secure connection and slipped the phone back beneath my apron. I walked out into the massive, overly decorated foyer, picking up my sponge and bucket. I knelt back down on the cold marble floor, resuming my role as the invisible, insignificant maid. Tonight, my son would return home, a conquering hero. He would strut through these doors, believing he had secured ultimate corporate supremacy and unimaginable wealth. He would demand a feast. He would demand respect. He would demand my complete unquestioning surrender. And I would give him exactly what he wanted. I would smile, serve him his dinner, and watch him gorge himself on a feast of absolute lies, knowing that every bite was bringing him one step closer to complete financial and social annihilation. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glittering light across the room, but the atmosphere had instantly frozen. The string quartet, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, allowed their music to stumble and fade into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dozens of Atlanta's most elite socialites, corporate titans, and wealthy real estate developers stood entirely motionless, their champagne glasses suspended in midair. Derek's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. He looked at me, standing tall and unbothered beside the most powerful venture capitalist in the state, and his brain simply refused to process the reality of the image. He marched forward, his velvet tuxedo suddenly looking less like the armor of a king and more like a cheap, desperate costume. "Mom, what exactly do you think you are doing?" Derek hissed, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper designed to avoid a public scene. "I told you to stay in the mudroom. You are embarrassing me. Get back there right now before I have security drag you out by your hair." He reached out, intending to grab my arm and physically pull me out of the room. He never made contact. Richard Sterling stepped smoothly in front of me, placing himself like an immovable wall between my son and me. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone carried the cold, absolute authority of a man who controlled billions of dollars. "You will step back, Derek," Richard said, his voice echoing clearly through the dead, silent room. "And you will address the chief executive officer of Caldwell Holdings with the respect her position demands." Derek stopped dead in his tracks. He blinked, looking from Richard to me and back to Richard. He let out a short, breathless laugh, looking around the room as if waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. "Richard, I think there is a misunderstanding," Derek stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is Vivian. She is my mother. She is a broke widow who lives in my basement. She is not the CEO of anything." Richard did not smile. He adjusted his pristine cuffs and looked at Derek with pure clinical disgust. "She is Vivian Caldwell," Richard stated loudly, ensuring every single guest in the mansion heard the truth. "The sole owner, founder, and majority shareholder of Caldwell Holdings. The woman who built the empire you have spent the last 4 years treating as your personal piggy bank. The woman who personally approved your hiring, and the woman who just authorized your absolute total ruin." The color drained from Derek's face so fast I thought he might faint. He stumbled backward, colliding with the edge of the glass coffee table. He looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time since my husband passed away. He saw the straight posture. He saw the cold, unyielding fire in my eyes. He saw the predator that had been living quietly in his basement. "You," Derek whispered, his voice trembling. "You own the firm." I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute silence of the room meant my words carried like thunder. "Did you really think your father built that entire company by himself, Derek?" I asked smoothly. "Did you think I was just a silent housewife baking cookies while he conquered the financial world? I was the architect. I wrote the code. I negotiated the acquisitions. I built the foundation of the empire that pays for the velvet suit you are wearing right now. And when your father died, I wanted to see if the son we raised was capable of leading it." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the ridiculous, gaudy decorations covering my beautiful home. "I wanted to see if you had integrity," I continued. "I wanted to see if you had honor." Instead, I found a weak, pathetic, entitled little boy who thought he could steal from my company and abuse his grieving mother just to impress a room full of people who do not care about him. Nia pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her diamond-encrusted gown sparkling under the lights. Her eyes were wide with panic. "Derek, what is she talking about? Tell her to stop." I turned my gaze to Nia, offering her a cold, empty smile. "He cannot stop me, Nia," I said. "Because as of 2 o'clock this afternoon, Derek is no longer a vice president at Caldwell Holdings. The promotion to senior partner was a fabrication. a simple test to see how far his arrogance would stretch, and he performed exactly as expected. Derek shook his head frantically. You cannot do this. I brought millions into the firm. I made acquisitions. I am untouchable. You are a thief! I snapped, my voice finally cracking like a whip. We conducted a silent forensic audit of your entire division. You embezzled $3.2 million from the mezzanine financing reserves over the last 4 years. You funneled capital through Cayman Island shell companies to buy luxury cars, fund this pathetic lifestyle, and pay off your aunt's underground gambling markers. We have every wire transfer. We have every digital fingerprint. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. The illusion of his power had been entirely shattered. The $300,000 you tried to wire this morning? Richard interjected smoothly. We intercepted it. We flagged your dummy vendor profiles. Your shadow accounts are empty. The corporate security team has already cleared out your office. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has the complete dossier of your financial crimes. You are fired. Derek, I said, staring directly into his terrified eyes. You are completely and utterly ruined. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Politicians and developers began whispering frantically to each other, quietly setting their drinks down and inching toward the front door, eager to distance themselves from a man who was about to be federally indicted. Nia let out a high-pitched sob, clutching her hands to her chest. No, this cannot be happening. We have status. We are rich. We have the cars. We have the house. I turned to my daughter-in-law. The sheer entitlement radiating from her, even in this moment of destruction, was breathtaking. You have absolutely nothing, Nia, I said softly. I ran a background check on that ridiculous Porsche you parade around town in. You thought Derek bought it with his bonuses. He financed it through a predatory lender using stolen corporate funds. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out a folded legal document. I held it up for her to see. I bought your auto loan through one of my subsidiary shell companies this afternoon, I announced. I own the title to your car, and because you are technically in default, I executed a repossession order. Right on cue, the heavy rumble of a commercial tow truck echoed from the front driveway. Flashing yellow lights reflected through the massive foyer windows. Nia let out a piercing scream and ran toward the front door, watching in absolute horror as her prized status symbol was hooked up and dragged down the driveway. Julie, who had been hiding near the back of the room, finally stepped forward. Her face was a mask of pure desperate fury. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me. You cannot do this to us! Julie shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. We are high society. We belong in this world. You are just a vindictive, hateful old woman trying to tear down everything we built. You cannot touch me. I have connections in this city that will crush you. I turned to my sister-in-law, the woman who had shoved me down a flight of stairs and threatened to lock me in a state-run nursing home. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. I pulled a stack of heavily stamped paper markers out of it and tossed them onto the glass coffee table right next to the non-disclosure agreement Derek had forced me to sign. Julie looked down at the markers. The blood instantly vanished from her face. Her knees buckled slightly and she had to grab the edge of the sofa to keep from collapsing onto the floor. You owe the Chicago syndicate over $200,000, Julie, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have been gambling away money you do not have, leveraging Derek's stolen funds to cover your pathetic addiction. But you do not owe the syndicate anymore. I bought your debt this afternoon. I paid the premium. I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice so only she and Derek could hear. I own you, Julie. Every single marker, every single late fee, and I demand immediate payment in full. Since I know you do not have a single dime to your name, my lawyers will be seizing your personal bank accounts, your jewelry, and every asset you possess by Monday morning. You belong in a prison cell, and I will make sure you get there. Julie clamped a hand over her mouth, a muffled sob escaping her lips. She collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands, completely broken. I turned back to Derek. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched, his velvet tuxedo looking too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. The arrogant, untouchable venture capitalist was gone. In his place was the terrified little boy who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. The house. Derek whispered, his voice cracking. You cannot take the house. It is all we have left. I looked around the grand living room, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the imported rugs, and the towering Christmas tree. You tried to force me to sign a quitclaim deed yesterday, I said loudly, addressing both Derek and the remaining guests who were eagerly watching the drama unfold. You tried to force me to surrender the title of my own home into your LLC so you could throw me out onto the street. You threatened to starve me. You threatened to lock me away. I shook my head, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. I did not sign the deed, Derek. I shredded it. I own this estate. I paid for every brick, every tile, and every piece of furniture in it. And since you saw fit to cancel my supplemental credit card and declare me a financial burden, I am officially executing my right as the property owner. I gestured toward the front door, where two large uniformed corporate security officers from Caldwell Holdings had silently materialized, standing shoulder to shoulder just inside the foyer. You are trespassing on my property, I declared, my voice ringing with finality. You, Nia, and Julie have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever clothes you can carry in your hands. You will leave the keys to the house on the counter. You will walk out that front door, and you will never return. If you refuse, my security team will physically remove you, and I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Derek dropped to his knees. The proud, arrogant son actually fell to the marble floor in front of me, tears streaming down his face. Mom, please, you cannot do this. We have nowhere to go. I will go to jail. Please, I am your son. I looked down at him. I remembered the coldness in his eyes when he locked me in the basement. I remembered the absolute lack of mercy he had shown me when he thought I was weak. You stopped being my son the moment you decided my life was worth less than your ego, I said softly. Get out of my house. I turned my back on him and walked toward the grand staircase. The string quartet, sensing the absolute finality of the moment, slowly raised their instruments and began to play a soft, elegant melody. I walked up the stairs, leaving the architects of my misery to pack their pathetic bags under the watchful eyes of my security team, surrounded by the shattered ruins of their own greed. The evening of the black tie gala arrived, draping the Alpharetta estate in a deceptive layer of prestige. A fleet of valets swarmed the sweeping circular driveway, expertly maneuvering a steady stream of imported luxury sedans and sports cars. The grand mahogany doors of the mansion were thrown wide open, spilling warm golden light, and the sophisticated melodies of a hired string quartet out into the crisp night air. Inside, the transformation was absolute and utterly grotesque. The mansion was packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta's absolute elite. There were prominent HBCU alumni, proud graduates of Morehouse and Spelman, adorned in sharp tailored tuxedos and sweeping designer gowns. There were ruthless real estate moguls boasting about their latest commercial acquisitions. There were high society socialites dripping in diamonds, their laughter sharp and practiced. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, electric, and dripping with a thick, suffocating layer of fake opulence. Every single person in the room was playing a part, performing wealth and status for an audience of their peers. And I was the lowest person on their carefully constructed totem pole. I stood in the drafty foyer near the heavy front doors, dressed in a humiliating, crisp, black and white maid's uniform. A stiff white apron was tied tightly around my waist, and my hair was pulled back into a severe, invisible bun. My assignment was simple. I was the coat check attendant. I was the invisible servant, tasked with handling the heavy mink coats, the cashmere scarves, and the tailored overcoats of the city's royalty. Good evening, sir. Allow me to take your coat. I repeated the phrase like a well-programmed machine. Guest after guest swept past me, handing over their expensive garments without a second glance. They did not make eye contact. They did not register my humanity. To them, I was merely an extension of the furniture, a functional piece of the mansion's lavish decor. Some tossed crumpled dollar bills onto the small silver tray beside my station, tipping me with a casual disdain that would have broken a weaker woman. But I did not feel broken. I felt an exhilarating, razor-sharp clarity. Standing in that drafty corner accepting their discarded coats, I was the most powerful person in the room. Hidden beneath the starch of my maid's uniform was the encrypted mobile device that linked me directly to the Caldwell Holdings master server. I legally owned the debts of the woman currently drinking martinis by the ice sculpture. I legally owned the luxury vehicle of the woman currently showing off her car keys to her envious friends. I held the absolute power to vaporize the career of the man hosting this magnificent charade. I was a predator disguised as prey, patiently watching the trap snap shut. From my station by the door, I had a perfect view of the grand living room. Derek was entirely in his element. He moved through the crowd with the slick, practiced grace of a seasoned politician. He clinked his crystal champagne flute against the glasses of wealthy investors, loudly recounting his fabricated corporate triumphs. He boasted about his impending promotion to senior partner, his voice carrying over the music, ensuring everyone within a 50-foot radius knew exactly how important he was. Nia clung to his arm like a glittering parasite. She wore a backless emerald green sequined gown that left practically nothing to the imagination. She projected the aura of a fiercely successful billionaire's wife, laughing shrilly at every joke and flashing her massive, highly financed engagement ring. Julie held court near the catered buffet, surrounded by younger socialites who hung on her every word as she dispensed terrible advice about vintage fashion and high-stakes poker. They were all completely intoxicated by their own manufactured glory. They believed they were untouchable. About an hour into the gala, the influx of arriving guests began to slow. I was organizing a row of heavy wool coats on the rolling metal rack when the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels approached my station. I turned to see Nia strutting toward me, flanked by two of her equally superficial friends. They held delicate crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne, their eyes locked on me with malicious intent. Nia stopped just inches from my station. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a cruel, satisfied sneer. She was relishing the power dynamic. She wanted an audience for her cruelty. Vivian, Nia said, drawing out the syllables of my name like a slow poison. You missed a spot on the floor over there. The guests are tracking in dirt and you are just standing here doing absolutely nothing. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of my apron. I am stationed at the coat check, Nia. Derek explicitly instructed me not to leave this post unless it was an emergency. Nia's eyes narrowed. She hated being contradicted, especially in front of her friends. Her grip on her champagne flute tightened. I am giving you a new instruction, Nia snapped, taking a step closer. You need to learn how to follow orders from the woman of the house. You need to know your exact place. Without breaking eye contact, Nia deliberately tilted her wrist. A steady stream of icy, sticky champagne poured out of her crystal flute. It did not hit the floor. She aimed it perfectly. The expensive liquid splashed directly over my sensible black work shoes, soaking instantly through the cheap fabric and chilling my toes. Her friends gasped in mock horror, followed immediately by a chorus of high-pitched, cruel giggles. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," Nia said, her voice dripping with fake, exaggerated sympathy. "Look what a mess I made. You better go fetch a mop and clean that up, Vivian. We cannot have the hired help walking around looking like a disaster. It reflects poorly on Derek." I looked down at my soaked shoes. The cold champagne seeped into my socks, uncomfortable and sticky. I looked back up at Nia. Her eyes were alight with sadistic victory. She had humiliated me. She had put the old broke widow firmly back into the dirt where she belonged. I did not react. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the lethal fury burning inside my chest. I simply bowed my head, a picture of perfect, defeated submission. "Right away, Nia," I said softly. "I will clean it up immediately." "Good," Nia sneered, turning her back on me. "Come on, girls, let us go find the photographer. I want to get a picture by the ice swan before it melts." I watched them walk away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. I reached for a cloth to wipe the liquid from my shoes, my face entirely devoid of emotion. Nia thought she had won. She thought she had asserted her dominance. She did not realize that her petty, cruel display was nothing more than the desperate thrashing of a fish caught in a net. I owned the car she drove. I owned the house she stood in. I owned the very ground beneath her designer heels. I could afford wet shoes. She could not afford what was coming next. The gala raged on the volume in the mansion, rising steadily as the expensive alcohol flowed. The air grew thick with the smell of rich colognes, roasted meats, and the sharp tang of ambition. Guests admired the cascading floral arrangements and praised the impeccable taste of their hosts. Derek and Nia accepted the compliments with aggressive humility, playing the role of the gracious newly minted elite. As the clock struck 9, the string quartet suddenly ceased playing. The sudden silence drew the attention of the crowded room. In the center of the grand living room, Derek stepped up onto the raised hearth of the massive stone fireplace. He held a fresh glass of champagne, a silver spoon poised in his other hand. He tapped the spoon against the crystal flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the remaining chatter. The guests turned toward him, a sea of expectant, wealthy faces waiting for their host to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced, his voice projecting effortlessly across the vast room. "If I could please have your attention for just a moment." The crowd murmured in agreement, shifting closer to the fireplace. Nia glided through the crowd, taking her place right beside the hearth, looking up at her husband with an expression of pure, manufactured adoration. Julie stood near the front row, holding her martini glass high. From my station in the shadowed hallway, I had an unobstructed view of the entire scene. I stood perfectly still, watching my son prepare to deliver his crowning speech. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," Derek began, flashing his brilliant, charming smile. "When Nia and I decided to host this little gathering, we wanted to bring together the brightest, most successful minds in Atlanta. Looking around this room, I can confidently say we have achieved exactly that." A polite ripple of applause washed over the guests. Derek nodded, soaking up the validation like dry earth absorbing rain. "As many of you know, this has been an incredible year for me professionally." Derek continued, his chest puffing out with pride. "I have dedicated my life to the financial sector. I have poured my blood, sweat, and tears into Caldwell Holdings, and I am thrilled to announce tonight that my hard work has finally been recognized at the absolute highest level." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build in the room. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes sweeping past the real estate moguls and the HBCU alumni. And then his gaze locked directly onto the dark hallway. He looked right at me, standing in my wet shoes and my maid's uniform. His smile grew sharper, crueler. He wanted to make sure I heard every single word. He wanted to make sure his victory was absolute. "This coming week," Derek declared, his voice ringing with supreme arrogance, "I will officially be stepping into the role of senior partner at Caldwell Holdings." The room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. Guests cheered, raising their glasses in a toast. Nia threw her arms in the air, practically vibrating with joy. Julie clapped loudly, her diamond bracelets catching the light. Derek raised his glass to quiet the crowd. "Thank you. Thank you. It is a massive responsibility, but I am ready to lead the firm into a new era of unprecedented wealth. We are going to dominate the market. And I promise you, this house, this party, this lifestyle, it is only the very beginning." He raised his crystal flute high above his head. "To success, to power, to the future." "To the future," the crowd echoed back, raising their glasses and drinking deeply. Derek stepped down from the hearth, immediately engulfed by a swarm of well-wishers and sycophants, eager to shake the hand of the new king. I watched him bask in the adoration, a conqueror surveying his conquered lands. He had reached the absolute peak of his mountain. He had built his entire identity on a throne of lies, embezzlement, and unyielding cruelty. The trap was fully loaded. The target was perfectly positioned. The black tie gala was a resounding, spectacular success, and the demolition was about to begin. Derek stood on the raised stone hearth in the center of the grand living room, the crystal chandeliers casting a brilliant, warm light over his custom-tailored velvet tuxedo. He raised his freshly poured glass of vintage champagne high above his head, demanding the absolute attention of the crowded room. The hired string quartet immediately ceased playing their bows, freezing over their instruments. The loud, self-important chatter of Atlanta's most elite socialites, ruthless real estate moguls, and prominent HBCU alumni died down to a respectful, expectant hush. "Thank you all for being here to witness this incredible milestone," Derek announced, his voice projecting with a practiced, sickening charisma. "As many of you know, I will officially be stepping into my new role as senior partner at Caldwell Holdings this week, but tonight is not just about corporate victories. Tonight is also about honoring family." Nia stood in the front row, her backless emerald gown sparkling brilliantly as she beamed up at him. She pressed her hands to her chest, playing the role of the devoted, adoring wife to absolute perfection. Julie hovered near the melting ice swan, a smug, satisfied smile plastered across her heavily contoured face. "My mother has been struggling deeply since my father passed away." Derek continued, shaking his head with an expression of mock-manufactured sympathy. "The heavy burden of managing this massive estate has simply become far too much for her fragile state. She needs rest. She needs peace. So tonight, we are officially celebrating her retirement. She is stepping down and signing the entire estate over to me, ensuring that her legacy is protected under my care." A polite, admiring ripple of applause washed over the elite guests. They viewed him as a dedicated, loving son stepping up to carry the weight of his aging mother's responsibilities. It was a masterful, nauseating manipulation of reality. Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy legal document. He had clearly procured a freshly forged deed to replace the one I had shredded in the basement, entirely unwilling to let his grand plan die. In his other hand, he produced a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes locking directly onto the dark hallway where I stood. "Mom, come on out here," Derek called out, his tone dripping with fake, syrupy warmth. "Come join us in the light. Come make it official." I stepped out of the shadows of the drafty mudroom. A sudden, confused hush fell over the back of the crowd as I walked into the bright golden light of the living room. I was still wearing the crisp, humiliating black and white maid's uniform. The stiff white apron was still tied tightly around my waist, and my shoes were still sticky from the champagne Nia had deliberately spilled on them an hour earlier. The stark contrast between my coarse attire and the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos was jarring, almost violent. Whispers began to spread like wildfire through the room. The elite guests parted to make way for me, their faces twisting with a mixture of confusion and profound discomfort. They recognized me instantly as the invisible woman who had just checked their heavy winter coats. They had tipped me with crumpled dollar bills. Now their wealthy host was calling me his mother. Nia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with pure venom. She was clearly irritated that Derek was bringing the hired help into the very center of her perfect opulent party. Julie narrowed her eyes, sipping her dry martini, watching my approach with a predator's calculating, nervous gaze. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not look at the floor. I looked directly at Derek, walking with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I reached the raised stone hearth. Derek stood above me, his smile fixed perfectly in place for his wealthy audience, but his eyes were wide with frantic, unspoken threats. He leaned down, extending his hand to help me up onto the stone platform. As his fingers gripped mine, he squeezed hard enough to bruise the bone. "Sign the paper," Derek hissed under his breath, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Smile, sign it, and get back to the coat room before I ruin you." I stepped up onto the hearth, turning to face the vast crowd of Atlanta's most powerful figures. The silence in the mansion was absolute and suffocating. Hundreds of eyes stared up at me, waiting for the frail, obedient mother to perform her final act of total surrender. Derek held out the freshly forged deed with his left hand. In his right hand, he offered me the heavy gold pen. "Go ahead, Mom," Derek said loudly, projecting his voice for the audience. "Make it official. Let me take the burden off your shoulders." I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the forged legal document. Then I looked at the silver microphone resting on a tall metal stand just a few feet away, set up earlier for the string quartet's announcements. I did not take the pen. Instead, I reached over and pulled the heavy microphone from the stand. The sudden movement caused the speakers to let out a sharp, brief whine of feedback. Several guests in the front row winced, stepping back. I held the microphone firmly in my right hand, turning my body to face my son. Derek's fake charismatic smile began to crack at the edges. His outstretched hand, still holding the gold pen, trembled slightly. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He knew I had deviated from the script. He knew he had lost control of the scene, but he was entirely trapped by his own massive public spectacle. He could not physically drag me away without destroying the perfect image he had just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct. I reached behind my back with my free hand. My fingers found the tight knot of the stiff white apron. With a single sharp tug, I pulled the strings loose. The heavy, coarse fabric fell away from my waist. I let it drop, watching it pool onto the expensive Persian rug at my feet. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. It was a highly deliberate, highly symbolic gesture. I was shedding the disguise. I was stripping away the submissive, invisible servant they had all ignored for the past 3 days. I stood before them in a simple, perfectly tailored black dress, radiating an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the grand mansion, clear, sharp, and dripping with icy precision. "I cannot sign this house over to you, Derek," I said, looking directly into his terrified, widening eyes. The room went entirely, impossibly silent. You could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace burning behind us. Nia took a step forward, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. Juli lowered her martini glass, the color completely draining from her heavily powdered face. Derek swallowed hard. He tried to maintain his composure, attempting to laugh off my statement for the benefit of the crowd. "Mom, what are you talking about? You are just confused. The paperwork is right here." I did not break eye contact. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring every single syllable hit the back walls of the estate. "Because I sold it this morning to the Caldwell Investment Group." Derek physically recoiled, the gold pen slipping from his numb fingers and clattering loudly against the stone hearth. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. The color vanished from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright chandelier lights. The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispering. The corporate titans in the room instantly recognized the name. Caldwell Investment Group was a titan in the financial sector, a shadow giant that acquired massive portfolios and liquidated failing corporations without a single ounce of mercy. Nia lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the hearth. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, the carefully constructed facade of the billionaire's wife shattering into a million pieces. "Derek, what is she saying? Make her stop." Juli pushed her way through the elite guests, her martini glass spilling clear liquid onto the polished hardwood floor. "You stupid old woman," Juli snapped, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "You do not own any investment group. You are broke. You scrub our floors. Security, get this crazy woman out of here right now." I kept the microphone firmly in my hand, my voice slicing effortlessly through the rising panic. "I am Vivian Caldwell," I announced, projecting my words to the very back of the mansion. "Sole founder-owner and acting chief executive officer of the Caldwell Investment Group. The company my son falsely claims to manage. The company he has been actively stealing from for the past 4 years." The murmurs turned into a deafening roar. Several prominent real estate moguls began to back away toward the grand foyer, instantly realizing that they were attending a highly illegal party hosted by a dead man walking. The air in the room, previously thick with fake opulence, suddenly turned freezing cold. Derek dropped the forged deed. He grabbed his hair, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a lie that could save him. "Mom, please!" Derek begged, his voice cracking entirely, dropping the microphone and stepping closer to me. "You are ruining everything. Stop doing this. I am your son." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had locked me in a dark basement and threatened to throw me into the gutter. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided my life was worth less than your fragile ego," I replied smoothly. You embezzled $3.2 million from my mezzanine financing reserves. You funneled stolen capital through offshore shell accounts to fund this pathetic illusion of wealth. You forced your own mother to work as a servant so you could parade around in a velvet suit. Nia let out a high-pitched wail, burying her face in her hands. No, this is a mistake. We are rich. We have the Porsche. We have the country club. I turned my gaze to Nia, offering her a smile entirely devoid of warmth. You have absolutely nothing, Nia, I stated clearly. I ran a forensic audit on your custom Porsche. Derek financed it through a predatory lender using stolen corporate funds. I bought your auto loan through one of my shell companies this afternoon. I legally own the title, and because you are in default, I executed an immediate repossession order. Right on cue, the heavy metallic rumble of a commercial tow truck echoed through the open front doors. Flashing yellow lights illuminated the grand driveway. Nia let out a piercing scream, abandoning Derek entirely as she sprinted toward the foyer, watching in absolute horror as her ultimate status symbol was hooked up and dragged away into the night. I turned my attention to Juli. She was frozen near the melting ice sculpture, her face a mask of pure terror. She recognized the lethal shift in the power dynamic. She knew she was trapped. And you, Juli, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous lethal register. You thought you could physically assault me and demand my submission. You thought your high society connections would protect you. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out a thick stack of stamped paper markers. I tossed them onto the hearth at her feet. You owe the Chicago syndicate over $200,000, I revealed, exposing her deepest, darkest secret to the entire room of Atlanta elites. You have been gambling away money you do not have. But you do not owe the syndicate anymore. I bought your debt this afternoon. I legally own every single marker, and I demand immediate payment in full. Since I know your bank accounts are completely empty, my lawyers will be seizing your personal assets by Monday morning. Julie's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the floor, her heavy pearl necklace clattering against the marble. The wealthy socialites she had been trying to impress immediately stepped away from her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She buried her face in her hands, completely and utterly broken. I looked back at Derek. He was standing on the hearth, a hollow, empty shell of a man. The magnificent castle he had built out of lies had just collapsed into dust. He had no job, no money, and no future. The federal authorities have the complete dossier of your financial crimes. Derek, I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. The corporate accounts are permanently frozen. Your shadow accounts are empty. You are standing in a house you do not own, wearing clothes you bought with stolen money, hosting a party you cannot afford. I dropped the microphone onto the stone hearth. It hit the ground with a loud, heavy thud. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever you can carry and get off my property, I ordered, turning my back on him. The string quartet sat frozen in the corner. The wealthy guests were already rushing for the coat check, desperate to retrieve their belongings and flee the catastrophic scene. I walked down from the hearth, my steps echoing through the mansion, leaving the architects of my misery to pack their pathetic bags and step out into the cold, unforgiving night. Before I could reach the base of the grand staircase, a sharp, desperate laugh sliced through the heavy atmosphere. Derek bounded down from the stone hearth, his velvet jacket slipping slightly off his shoulder. He scooped up the microphone I had dropped, his hands shaking so violently that the metal casing rattled against his expensive ring. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse my mother," Derek announced, his voice tight and breathless, projecting a forced, manufactured calm. "She is clearly unwell. The grief of losing my father has finally taken its toll on her mind." He offered the crowd an apologetic, patronizing smile. He was desperately trying to glue the shattered pieces of his reality back together. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the remaining real estate moguls and socialites, pleading silently for their complicity in his delusion. "Mom, you do not own Caldwell Investment Group." Derek chuckled, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Caldwell is a multi-billion-dollar global venture capital firm. You are a grieving widow, you scrub floors, you burn silk blouses in the laundry room. You do not even know how to operate a modern bank account. please stop embarrassing yourself and go back downstairs before I have to call a medical professional." The crowd remained entirely motionless. No one laughed with him. No one offered him a sympathetic nod. The air in the mansion was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. Derek turned his desperate gaze toward the heavy oak doors of the adjacent VIP parlor. He knew the most important guest of the evening was somewhere in the house. He needed absolute validation, and he needed it immediately. Richard Derek called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Sterling, please, come out here and tell these people. Tell my mother she is completely insane. Tell them who actually runs Caldwell Holdings. Tell them about my promotion to senior partner." The heavy oak doors of the parlor slowly swung open. Richard Sterling stepped out into the grand living room. The chief executive officer of Caldwell Holdings looked absolutely immaculate in a razor-sharp midnight blue tuxedo. He exuded an aura of quiet, terrifying power that instantly commanded the respect of every corporate titan in the room. The murmuring crowd parted immediately, carving a clear, wide path for him as he walked toward the center of the room. Derek's face lit up with profound relief. He practically sagged against the fireplace. "Thank God," Derek breathed into the microphone. "Richard, please handle this. My mother is having a psychotic break. She is rambling about shell companies and audits. She actually thinks she is your boss. Have security remove her so we can continue the gala." Richard did not smile. He did not break his stride. He walked directly toward Derek, his polished shoes silent against the hardwood floor. Derek eagerly extended his right hand, waiting for the firm, validating handshake of his superior. He waited for the man who paid his massive salary to restore order and banish the crazy old maid back to the basement. Richard Sterling completely ignored Derek's outstretched hand. He did not even look at him. He walked right past my son, treating him as if he were nothing more than a transparent ghost occupying empty space. Richard stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He stood tall, adjusting his cuffs with sharp, precise movements. Then the most feared and respected venture capitalist in the city of Atlanta lowered his head and offered me a deep, unwavering bow of absolute submission. "Everything is in order," Madam Chairwoman, Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead silent room. "The federal authorities have received the embezzlement dossier. The corporate accounts are permanently frozen. The board of directors has been notified of your actions, and they stand completely behind your directives. Your empire is secure." The microphone slipped from Derek's hand. It hit the stone hearth with a deafening screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears. But Derek did not flinch. He could not move. His brain had entirely short-circuited. Madam Chairwoman Derek repeated the words spilling from his lips like ash. I took a step forward, leaving the crumpled maid's apron on the floor behind me. I looked at the man who shared my blood, the man who had treated me like a disposable piece of trash for the sake of a velvet suit and a country club membership. I am the silent majority shareholder of Caldwell Investment Group. I declared, my voice echoing with icy, unyielding authority. I hold 78% of the voting rights. I own the board. I own the subsidiaries. I own the shell companies. And I am Richard Sterling's direct boss. Derek stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold stone of the fireplace. "No, that is impossible. Dad built the company. Dad was the genius. Dad ran the firm. You were just his wife." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that finally revealed the true depth of my intellect. "Your father was a brilliant salesman, Derek." I explained, my tone clinical and precise. He had the charisma. He had the handshake. He knew how to close a deal over a round of golf. But I wrote the algorithms. I built the financial architecture that allowed the firm to acquire and liquidate assets at a global scale. Your father was the face of the company, but I was the brain. We designed it that way specifically because men like you underestimate women like me. I gestured around the lavish, obnoxiously decorated living room. When your father passed away, I stepped into the shadows. I continued. I installed Richard as the public CEO to keep the vultures at bay. I wanted to grieve in peace, but more importantly, I wanted to see what kind of man you had become. We gave you a vice president title. We gave you an exorbitant salary. We handed you the keys to a kingdom you did not build just to see if you were worthy of eventually taking the throne. I paused, letting the absolute devastation of my words sink into his skin. You were not worthy, Derek. You were a parasite. You took the wealth we handed you, and you used it to fund a pathetic manufactured illusion of superiority. You treated the employees like garbage. You treated the firm like a personal ATM. And when you thought I was a broke, helpless widow, you forced me to scrub your toilets and check the coats of your friends. You built your entire identity on a mountain of my money. Derek's chest heaved. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. The blood had entirely left his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He looked wildly at Richard, then at the crowd, and finally back to me. You set me up, Derek whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. You let me plan this party. You let me think I was getting promoted. I did not set you up, I corrected sharply. I simply gave you enough rope to hang yourself. You chose to embezzle $3 million. You chose to force your mother into a maid's uniform. I just stood back and watched you build your own gallows. The room erupted. The silence finally shattered, replaced by a chaotic storm of shocked gasps, furious whispers, and the rapid clicking of cell phone cameras. The elite socialites and real estate moguls who had been clinking glasses with Derek just 10 minutes ago were now actively backing away from him. He was corporate poison. He was a walking federal indictment, and nobody in that room wanted to be caught in the blast radius of his destruction. Nia was hyperventilating near the grand piano. She clawed at her diamond necklace as if it were choking her. She looked at Derek, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. The money was gone. The cars were gone. The status was gone. She was married to a broke, unemployed felon. Juli remained on the floor by the melting ice sculpture, entirely catatonic. She stared at the stack of gambling markers I had thrown at her feet, realizing that she was going to spend the rest of her life working to pay off a debt she owed directly to me. Derek looked at the crowd, turning their backs on him. He looked at Nia, who was physically shrinking away from his presence. He looked at Richard, who stood like an executioner waiting for the final command. And then his physical strength simply evaporated. Derek's knees buckled. The arrogant, untouchable vice president collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug. He fell hard, his custom velvet tuxedo bunching up around his shoulders. He knelt on the floor, staring blankly at the crumpled white maid's apron I had discarded just moments before. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The maternal instinct to protect him had been thoroughly burned away by his own cruelty. Richard, I said, not taking my eyes off the broken man on the floor. Yes, Madam Chairwoman, Richard replied instantly. Ensure the corporate security team oversees their departure. I instructed, my voice cutting through the noise of the panicking crowd. They have 3 minutes left to pack their bags. If they take a single item purchased with embezzled funds, add it to the federal charges. I want this house completely empty by midnight. Understood, Richard said. He turned toward the foyer and gave a sharp nod to the large uniformed security officers waiting by the doors. They immediately marched into the living room, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. I did not wait to watch them leave. I had spent enough time entertaining parasites. I turned my back on my son, walked through the parting crowd of Atlanta elites, and headed toward the grand staircase to reclaim my home. I reached the first polished oak step of the grand staircase, my hand resting firmly on the cool, smooth mahogany banister. The sheer, suffocating weight of the silence in the living room pulled at my back. I stopped. I turned around slowly, looking down from my elevated position at the absolute magnificent wreckage I had orchestrated. Derek was still on his knees, staring blankly at the Persian rug. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been violently severed. Richard Sterling had not moved from his position. He stood tall, a beacon of clinical corporate execution. He snapped his fingers sharply. His lead security officer stepped forward out of the shadows, handing Richard a sleek, heavy black leather folder. Richard opened it with terrifying precision. He pulled out 2 thick, heavily stamped legal documents and tossed them casually onto the floor right in front of Derek's trembling hands. That is your official termination letter, Richard announced, his voice slicing through the dead air of the mansion. Terminated with extreme prejudice for gross misconduct, fraud, and theft. And the second document is your formal notice of impending federal criminal charges. Madam Chairwoman was highly thorough. Derek did not reach for the papers. He just stared at them as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. $3.2 million, Derek, I said, my voice easily carrying across the room without the need for a microphone. I wanted every single Atlanta socialite and corporate titan in that room to hear the exact price of my son's pathetic ego. You drained the mezzanine financing reserves. You set up dummy vendor profiles. You thought you were an untouchable mastermind, but you left massive digital fingerprints on every single wire transfer you sent to the Cayman Islands. Every fraudulent invoice, every offshore transfer, every single dime you stole to buy this ridiculous lifestyle is documented in those pages. The whispers among the elite guests grew frantic. The real estate moguls and venture capitalists who had been patting Derek on the back just 20 minutes ago were now actively edging toward the heavy front doors. They looked at Derek with pure, unadulterated disgust. In their world, ruthlessness was expected, but getting caught stealing from your own mother was a terminal infection. Derek was officially radioactive. Nia suddenly let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. The sound shattered the remaining tension in the room. She violently shoved herself away from Derek, stumbling backward in her expensive emerald gown, as if proximity to him might somehow make her guilty by association. No, Nia shrieked, waving her manicured hands frantically in the air. I did not know anything about this. He lied to me. He told me he earned those bonuses. He told me he was brilliant. I am innocent. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of his accounts. She looked wildly around the room, desperate to find a single sympathetic face among the wealthy guests. She found only cold, judging stares. Nia realized instantly that her entire social standing had just been incinerated. She was going down with the ship, and her instinct was to throw her husband directly into the propellers to save herself. You lied to me, you pathetic loser, Nia screamed at Derek, kicking her designer heel at his knee. You told me we were royalty. You ruined my life. Derek did not even flinch when her shoe struck him. He remained entirely catatonic, staring at his termination letter. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. The two massive suited corporate security officers, who had been standing guard in the foyer, immediately stepped forward, closing the distance between the front door and the hearth. They moved with absolute military precision, flanking Nia and trapping her against the edge of the grand piano. "What are you doing?" Nia gasped, clutching her glittering designer clutch bag tightly to her chest. "Do not touch me." I stepped down from the staircase, walking slowly back toward the center of the room. My eyes were locked on my daughter-in-law. "Your ridiculous Porsche is already sitting on a flatbed tow truck in my driveway, Naya," I stated calmly. "But since the vehicle was purchased with stolen Caldwell Holdings capital, my LLC legally owns the repossessed assets. All of them." I nodded to the lead security officer. "Hand over the keys, Nia. Right now." Nia's mouth fell open. She clutched her sequined dress, shaking her head in frantic denial. "You cannot do this. I need my car. I need to leave." "You are not driving anywhere," I replied smoothly. "Hand over the keys or my security team will detain you until the federal agents arrive to sort out your complicity in your husband's massive embezzlement scheme." Panicking Nia ripped open her clutch, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She pulled out the heavy, leather-bound Porsche key fob and threw it onto the marble floor. It skittered across the tile, stopping near Richard's polished shoes. The security officer calmly picked it up and dropped it into a heavy plastic evidence bin he carried at his side. "And the bag," I commanded, pointing directly at the glittering clutch she held against her chest. Nia gasped, her eyes welling up with furious tears. "This is my property. Derek bought this for my birthday. It is a limited edition Birkin." "Exactly." I smiled, a cold, empty expression. "Derek bought it. With my money. Which means it belongs to me." "Drop the bag into the bin, Nia." She sobbed loudly, an ugly grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She looked at the elite guests, pleading for someone to intervene, but the crowd simply watched her humiliation with a morbid, detached fascination. Defeated and shaking, Nia opened her hands. The expensive designer bag fell into the security officer's plastic bin with a dull thud. "Empty your pockets," Richard ordered sharply, stepping closer to Derek. "The watches, the cufflinks, the wallet. Everything purchased with corporate funds stays in this house." Derek slowly, mechanically began to strip himself of his jewelry. He unhooked his heavy gold cufflinks and dropped them onto the stone hearth. He unclasped the $50,000 platinum watch from his wrist and set it down next to his termination letter. He was stripping away his armor piece by piece, exposing the weak, terrified boy hiding underneath the velvet suit. Juli had been watching the systematic dismantling of her family from the floor near the melting ice sculpture. She finally found her voice. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive gown rumpled and stained with spilled alcohol. She rushed toward me, her hands clasped together in a desperate, frantic, pleading motion. "Vivian, please!" Juli cried out, her voice cracking with pure panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot throw us out into the street. We are family. We are your blood. You are a Christian woman. You have to forgive us." I looked at my sister-in-law. I looked at the woman who had laughed while I scrubbed the grout in her bathroom. I looked at the woman who had threatened to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward just so she could redecorate my living room. I felt absolutely zero pity for her. Her tears were entirely fake, a desperate survival tactic from a woman who had just realized she was completely out of moves. "Family," I repeated, rolling the word around in my mouth as if it tasted like poison. "Family does not lock a grieving widow in a freezing basement. Family does not force a mother to wear a maid's uniform and serve drinks to strangers in her own home. Family does not forge legal documents to steal an estate. You do not get to play the family blood card when you are the one who set the house on fire." I reached into the inner lining of my dress and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I held it out toward her. Juli stared at it, refusing to take it. I let it drop from my fingers. It hit the floor, spilling pages of highly detailed financial records and heavily stamped gambling debts across the polished wood. "That is the printed, itemized dossier of your bought-out gambling debts," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the back of the room. "I own every single marker you signed with the Chicago syndicate. I own your debts, Juli. I own you." Juli fell to her knees, scrambling to gather the papers, her eyes scanning the brutal, undeniable proof of her total financial ruin. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack your bags and vacate my property, Juli," I stated, my voice echoing with the absolute terrifying finality of a gavel striking wood. 10 minutes to gather whatever cheap, worthless clothes you brought into my house. If you are still standing on this estate when the clock strikes midnight, you will leave in handcuffs. You either walk out that front door right now, or you go directly to jail." Juli let out a guttural, heartbroken wail. She crawled backward on her hands and knees, clutching the dossier of her debts to her chest. She scrambled to her feet and ran wildly toward the grand staircase, shoving past the stunned guests, desperate to reach her guest room and salvage whatever she could carry. Nia followed her immediately. The former billionaire's wife hiked up the skirt of her emerald gown and sprinted toward the stairs, her bare feet slapping loudly against the hardwood floor. She was sobbing hysterically, a pathetic, broken mess of a woman who had just lost everything she valued in the world. I turned my attention back to Derek. He remained on his knees by the fireplace, completely surrounded by the physical evidence of his crimes. The forged deed, the termination letter, the platinum watch, the gold cufflinks. He was entirely alone. His wife had abandoned him. His aunt had fled. His powerful friends had vanished into the shadows. "Get up, Derek," I commanded, my tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You have 10 minutes. Do not make me ask security to drag you out by your collar." Derek slowly raised his head. His eyes were completely bloodshot, his face wet with tears. He looked at me, searching for a single ounce of mercy, searching for the mother who used to bake him cookies and bandage his scraped knees. He found nothing but cold, hard steel. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the stone mantel for support. He did not say a word. He turned and walked slowly toward the stairs. His head hung low, a defeated, ruined man, marching toward his own exile. Richard stepped up beside me, handing me a fresh crystal flute of champagne. "A masterfully executed restructuring, Madam Chairwoman," Richard said quietly, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. I took the champagne flute. I looked around the grand living room. The remaining guests were silent, watching me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound respect. They knew exactly who held the power in Atlanta. They knew exactly who Vivian Caldwell was. I raised my glass, offering a silent toast to the empty room, and took a slow, satisfying sip. The house was finally mine again. The heavy mahogany front doors remained wide open, inviting the biting chill of the winter night air to sweep through the grand foyer. I lowered my champagne flute and watched the final act of their humiliation play out. Down the sweeping staircase came the three architects of my temporary misery. They were flanked by four towering corporate security officers whose stone-cold expressions offered zero sympathy. The grand, triumphant exit Derek had always envisioned for himself had manifested as a brutal, highly public expulsion. Derek walked point. He dragged a scuffed, oversized black duffel bag behind him. His arrogant strut was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated shuffle. His custom velvet tuxedo jacket was draped carelessly over his arm, looking more like a discarded rag than a symbol of ultimate power. Behind him came Nia. The sparkling emerald gown that had dazzled the room just an hour ago now looked utterly ridiculous as she hauled two black plastic garbage bags filled with hastily gathered clothes. Her expensive makeup ran down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. She refused to look at Derek, her face twisted in a mask of pure, bitter resentment. Juli brought up the rear. She clutched the manila folder containing her bought-out gambling debts tightly to her chest like a protective shield. She shivered violently, her bare shoulders exposed to the cold draft, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as if expecting the Chicago syndicate to step out of the shadows right then and there. The remaining high society guests, the exact people Derek had bent over backward to impress, lined the foyer like a hostile jury. They did not offer words of comfort. They offered harsh, judging whispers. They pointed. They stared. They watched the mighty vice president and his glittering wife being thrown out with the trash. The security officers marched them straight out the front doors and down the sweeping front steps. They stopped at the very edge of the driveway, forcing the three of them to step off the pristine pavement and onto the cold, hard curb. I walked to the threshold of the grand entrance. Derek turned around, standing under the harsh glow of the street lamp. He looked up at me, standing in the doorway of the estate he had tried to steal, flanked by the CEO, who answered directly to my command. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final, desperate apology. "Shut the doors," I instructed the lead security officer. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a resounding, thunderous boom. The deadbolt engaged with a sharp, heavy click. They were officially locked out in the cold, completely stripped of their wealth, their fabricated status, and every last ounce of their pride. 3 months later, the dust had settled, and the brutal reality of their actions had entirely caught up with them. The federal authorities did not handle Derek with kid gloves. The forensic audit provided by Caldwell Holdings was an airtight, undeniable roadmap of his massive embezzlement scheme. He was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate theft, and money laundering. With his bank accounts completely frozen and his assets seized to pay back the stolen corporate funds, Derek could not afford a high-powered defense attorney. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who had zero interest in hearing his fabricated excuses. While awaiting trial, Derek had to find a way to survive. The former venture capitalist, the man who used to scoff at people who worked with their hands, was now employed at a local big-box hardware store. He spent his days wearing a bright orange vest, hauling bags of heavy mulch, and loading lumber into the back of pickup trucks for minimum wage. His velvet tuxedos were a distant memory. He lived in a tiny, cramped studio apartment over a noisy laundromat, spending his lonely evenings staring at a cheap television and dreading his impending federal court date. Nia did exactly what a parasite does when its host dies. She detached and ran. She filed for divorce the very morning after the gala, convinced she could quickly find another wealthy target to maintain her lavish lifestyle. But high society circles are incredibly small, and word travels fast. Everyone in Atlanta knew she was tied to a disgraced embezzler. Worse, her name was officially attached to the fraudulent loans Derek had used to finance her luxury cars and designer bags. She was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. Her credit was completely destroyed. The wealthy men she tried to court ran in the opposite direction, leaving her stuck working double shifts at a retail cosmetics counter, just to afford the rent on a small, gloomy apartment. Juli suffered perhaps the most poetic downfall of them all. She had been evicted from her comfortable lifestyle and was now terrified of her own shadow. She lived in a cheap, dingy motel just off the interstate, paying weekly rates in cash. My legal team had executed absolute authority over her assets, seizing her bank accounts to satisfy the gambling debts I had purchased. She spent her days working as a receptionist at a loud, chaotic auto repair shop, jumping out of her skin every time the front door opened, perpetually paranoid that collectors were coming to collect the rest of her debt. They had all gotten exactly what they deserved. As for me, I realized I did not want the Alpharetta estate anymore. It was a beautiful house, but its walls held far too many memories of betrayal and disrespect. I quietly listed the mansion, sold it to a foreign investor for a massive profit, and relocated to the heart of the city. I now live in a breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse in Buckhead. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, flooding the expansive living room with bright, warm light. I stepped out onto the sprawling wrap-around balcony, the vibrant, bustling Atlanta skyline stretching out beautifully beneath me. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the promise of a brand new day. I was not wearing a coarse, humiliating maid's uniform. I was not wearing a stiff white apron. I wore a flowing emerald green silk robe that caught the gentle morning breeze. My hair was styled perfectly, and my posture was incredibly relaxed. I leaned against the glass railing, holding a delicate porcelain cup filled with expensive imported chamomile tea. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. There was no Derek demanding his meals. There was no Juli snapping her fingers at me. There was no Nia intentionally spilling drinks on my shoes. There was no apron. There was no abuse. There was only absolute, unbothered peace. I had built a financial empire with my own brilliant mind. I had successfully defended it against the very people who should have protected me, and I had reclaimed my total independence. I smiled at the city below, taking another sip of my tea, completely ready to enjoy the magnificent, limitless future I had secured for myself. Family shouldn't be a free pass to treat you like a servant. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give toxic people is letting karma teach them the lesson you refuse to. Have you ever had a relative mistake your kindness for weakness? Let me know in the comments.